The courtroom went silent when the 9-year-old girl wheeled herself to the front. Judge Harrison Stone, paralyzed from the waist down for 15 years, looked down from his bench at the child in the wheelchair. She locked eyes with him and said 5 words that would shatter everything. "Let my father go and I'll walk again." They laughed. Until she stood up. And when the truth came out, the judge wept for the first time since the accident that stole his legs. Judge Harrison Stone had presided over Courtroom 4B in downtown Chicago for 23 years. For the first 8 of those years, he'd walked into that courtroom on his own 2 legs, his black robe flowing behind him, his presence commanding immediate respect. Then came the accident, the drunk driver, the shattered spine, and the wheelchair that became his new throne of justice. Some said the accident made him harder. Others said it made him see the world more clearly, stripped of sympathy for those who made excuses. Harrison himself never talked about it. He simply rolled into court each morning, pulled himself up to the bench using the custom lift system, and dispensed justice with an iron fist wrapped in legal precedent. On a grey Tuesday morning in October, the case of Illinois versus James Cooper came before his bench. Harrison reviewed the file with the same methodical attention he gave every case: theft, breaking and entering, a warehouse owned by Meridian Industries, one of Chicago's largest pharmaceutical companies. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward. Security footage showed a man matching James Cooper's description entering the warehouse at 2:47 a.m. An anonymous tip had led police to Cooper's apartment, where they'd found company equipment. Cooper claimed he'd been home asleep, that someone had planted the evidence that he'd never even been to that warehouse. Harrison had heard it all before. The innocent man routine. The frame-up defense, 23 years on the bench, had made him skeptical of convenient alibis and convenient scapegoats. James Cooper stood before him in an ill-fitting suit that had probably been borrowed for the trial. He was 34 years old, a maintenance worker at a hospital across town, single father. No prior criminal record. None of that mattered if the evidence pointed to guilt. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison's voice filled the courtroom with the authority of someone who'd pronounced sentence on hundreds of defendants. "The evidence against you is substantial. Security footage, physical evidence found in your possession, and your inability to provide a credible alibi. Your Honor, please." James's voice cracked. "I have a daughter. She's 9 years old. She needs me. I didn't do this. I swear to God I didn't do this." Harrison's jaw tightened. The defendant's personal circumstances were not his concern. The law was his concern. "Mr. Cooper, this court has heard your plea. However, the jury has found you guilty on all counts. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 5 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections." The gavel came down with the finality of a door slamming shut. James Cooper's legs buckled. 2 bailiffs caught him before he hit the floor. His lawyer, a overworked public defender, was already gathering his papers, ready to move on to the next hopeless case. "No," James was saying over and over. "No, please. My daughter. Who's going to take care of my daughter?" Harrison had already moved on to the next file. The bailiffs led James away. Court was adjourned. Just another Tuesday. Just another conviction. Just another man who claimed innocence in a system that had heard every lie ever invented. What Harrison didn't know, what the prosecution hadn't bothered to investigate thoroughly, was that James Cooper was telling the truth. The real thief was a Meridian Industries employee named Derek Walsh, who needed a fall guy for his scheme to steal and sell experimental medications on the black market. Walsh had chosen James at random, a hospital worker whose security badge could plausibly give him access to medical facilities, whose night shift schedule made it easy to claim he could have been at the warehouse. Walsh had planted the evidence, sent the anonymous tip, paid a security guard to doctor the footage timestamp. It was almost perfect. And it would have stayed perfect if not for a 9-year-old girl who refused to let her father become another statistic. Lily Cooper had been in a wheelchair for 4 years. The doctors called it psychogenic paralysis, a condition where the mind convinced the body it couldn't walk despite no physical damage to the spine or nervous system. That had started the night her mother died. Sarah Cooper had been killed in a car accident on Lily's 5th birthday. One moment, Lily was a healthy, active kindergartner. The next, she couldn't move her legs. James had taken her to specialists across the country. Chicago, New York, the Mayo Clinic. They all said the same thing. Physically, there was nothing wrong. The paralysis was psychological, trauma-induced. It might resolve with therapy, or it might not. The human mind was more powerful and more mysterious than any medicine they could prescribe. So Lily and James had built a life around her wheelchair. He'd modified their small apartment with ramps, quit his better-paying job for one with flexible hours so he could take her to physical therapy 3 times a week. They'd become a team, the two of them against a world that had taken Sarah away and left them to figure out how to keep going. The night James was arrested, Lily had been staying with Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor. The police had come at midnight, flashlights blazing, shouting about warrants and evidence. By the time Lily wheeled herself to the door, her father was already in handcuffs, being led away. "Dad!" she'd screamed. "Dad, what's happening?" "It's a mistake, baby," James had called back. "Just a mistake. I'll be home soon, I promise." But he didn't come home soon. The trial happened fast, too fast. The public defender had barely put up a fight. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. And just like that, Lily's father was going to prison for 5 years. Mrs. Patterson tried to explain it to Lily as gently as she could. There had been a trial. A judge had decided. Her father would be away for a while, but she'd be taken care of. Social services would find a good foster home. She'd visit her dad regularly. It would be okay. But Lily knew it wouldn't be okay. She'd already lost her mother. She couldn't lose her father too. And somewhere deep inside her, in the place where her legs had forgotten how to work, she knew something else. Her father was innocent. She'd seen him that night, the night the robbery supposedly happened. He'd been home. She'd woken up from a nightmare about her mother, and he'd been there, sitting in the chair beside her bed like he always was when she had bad dreams. 2:47 a.m., the time on the security footage. Her father had been reading to her from her favorite book, but nobody had asked her. Nobody had thought to interview a 9-year-old girl. And by the time Lily understood what had happened, the trial was over. So Lily made a decision. She wheeled herself to the library and used the computer to research. She learned about appeals and motions and legal procedures. She read everything she could about Judge Harrison Stone, and she discovered something interesting, something that gave her an idea so impossible, so audacious that it might actually work. Judge Stone had been paralyzed in a car accident 15 years ago. But what most people didn't know was that his paralysis, like hers, had a psychological component. Oh, the initial injury was real enough. Spinal damage that should have healed better than it did. But somewhere along the way, trauma had taken root. His mind had decided that walking was too dangerous, too risky. Better to stay in the chair. Better to be safe. Lily had read about it in an old newspaper article, buried deep in the archives. An interview with Stone's doctor, who'd suggested that with the right therapy, the judge might regain some mobility. Stone had refused, said he'd learned to live with it, said it didn't matter. But Lily understood what the article didn't say outright. Judge Stone's paralysis, like hers, was held in place by fear, and fear could be broken. She spent 2 weeks planning. Mrs. Patterson thought she was doing homework. The social worker who visited thought she was adjusting well, all things considered. Nobody suspected that a 9-year-old in a wheelchair was about to do something that would make national news. On the morning of her father's sentencing hearing, where the judge would officially commit James to the Department of Corrections, Lily convinced Mrs. Patterson to bring her to the courthouse, said she wanted to see her father one last time before he was transferred. Mrs. Patterson, with her kind heart and belief that children should be allowed closure, agreed. She wheeled Lily through the courthouse doors, through security up the elevator to the 4th floor, to courtroom 4B. When they entered, James was already standing before the bench, his wrists in chains. He turned and saw his daughter, and his face crumpled. "Lily, baby, you shouldn't be here." But Lily was exactly where she needed to be. She wheeled herself forward, past the bar that separated spectators from participants, past the bailiff who moved to stop her, and then hesitated because what threat could a child in a wheelchair possibly pose? Judge Harrison Stone looked down from his elevated bench. He'd seen many things in 23 years. Defendants who pled, families who wept, lawyers who performed, but he'd never seen this. A child, wheeling herself to the center of his courtroom with a determination that seemed far too old for her years. "Young lady," he said, his voice stern but not unkind, "this is not appropriate. You need to return to the gallery." "Your Honor," Lily said, and her voice was clear and strong, "my name is Lily Cooper. That's my father, and I have something to say." The courtroom had gone completely silent. The prosecutor looked confused. James's public defender looked alarmed. The bailiffs looked to the judge for direction. Harrison should have had her removed immediately, should have maintained the order and dignity of his court. But something in the girl's eyes stopped him. A certainty, a knowing. "You have 1 minute," he said. Lily nodded. She looked up at the judge, at this man in his own wheelchair, at this person who'd sent her father to prison. And she made her impossible offer. "Let my father go," she said, "and I'll walk again." For 3 full seconds, nobody in courtroom 4B moved. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to unsee, impossible to unhear. Then someone in the gallery laughed, a short, nervous bark of disbelief. The laugh spread. The prosecutor smirked. A bailiff shook his head. Even James's public defender looked embarrassed, like this outburst from a child was the final indignity in an already lost cause. Judge Harrison Stone didn't laugh. He stared at Lily Cooper with an expression that mixed confusion with something else. Something that might have been recognition. "Young lady," he said slowly, "I don't know what you think you're offering, but this court deals in law, not miracles. Your father has been convicted by a jury of his peers. That conviction stands." "He didn't do it," Lily said. Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair. "He was home with me that night. I had a nightmare. He was reading to me at 2:47 in the morning. That's when the robbery was supposed to happen. He couldn't have been in 2 places at once." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the defendant's daughter is clearly traumatized and confused. This is exactly why we don't allow children to testify without proper vetting. She's trying to create an alibi after the fact." "I'm not confused," Lily shot back. "And I'm not lying. My dad keeps a journal. Every night he writes down what happened that day. Every single night. That night he wrote about my nightmare, about reading to me from Charlotte's Web, about how I fell asleep at 3:15 a.m. James's public defender suddenly looked alert. "Your Honor, if such a journal exists, it would constitute potential evidence that wasn't presented at trial." "Because nobody asked for it," Lily said. Her voice was rising now, powered by frustration and desperation. "Nobody asked me. Nobody asked about the journal. You just decided my dad was guilty and locked him up." Harrison felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same tightness he'd felt 15 years ago, right before the accident. The feeling that something was spinning out of control, that he'd missed something important, that the world was about to change whether he was ready or not. "Even if this journal exists," Harrison said carefully, "it proves nothing. A father could easily fabricate evidence to protect himself." "Then test it," Lily challenged. "The journal has dates, times, details. Check them against other things. Phone records, receipts, my therapy appointments. He writes everything down because after my mom died, he was scared he'd forget the small moments. He didn't want to lose any more memories." The courtroom had stopped laughing. People were listening now, really listening. Harrison could feel the shift, the way the air in the room had changed from mockery to uncertainty. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, "this is highly irregular. The trial is over. The verdict is in. We can't reopen discovery based on the emotional plea of a child." Harrison looked at Lily, at this 9-year-old in a wheelchair who'd wheeled herself into his courtroom and offered an impossible trade. He should shut this down, should move forward with the sentencing, should maintain the integrity of the legal process. But something in her eyes reminded him of himself, of the moment after the accident, when the doctors had told him he'd never walk again and he'd refused to believe them, had fought through 6 months of physical therapy, determined to prove them wrong, until the day his mind decided the fight was too hard, the risk too great, and he'd settled into the wheelchair as his permanent reality. "The journal," Harrison said. "Where is it?" "In our apartment," Lily answered immediately. "In the drawer beside his bed. The police didn't take it because they weren't looking for evidence of innocence. They were only looking for evidence of guilt." The words hit like a slap. Harrison's hands tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. In 23 years on the bench, he'd prided himself on impartiality, on following evidence wherever it led. But this child was suggesting that the system had failed, that he had failed. "And the walking?" he asked, his voice quieter now. You said you'd walk again if I let your father go. What did you mean by that? Lily took a deep breath. This was the moment she'd been building toward. The impossible gamble that would either save her father or make her look like a delusional child. I've been paralyzed for 4 years, she said, since the night my mom died. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with me, that it's all in my head, that I'm too scared to walk because walking means moving forward, and moving forward means accepting that she's really gone. Her voice wavered but didn't break. I've been in therapy. I've tried everything. But nothing works because I can't let go of that night. Can't let go of the fear. But when my dad got arrested, when I realized I might lose him too, I understood something. She looked directly at Harrison. Fear is a choice. Being paralyzed is a choice. Not a conscious choice, but a choice my brain made to keep me safe. And I can unmake that choice. Right here. Right now. If it means saving my father. The courtroom was silent again, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for something momentous. You're saying you can just decide to walk, the prosecutor said skeptically. That's not how medical conditions work, isn't it? Lily looked at him. You ever heard of psychogenic paralysis? Of people who go blind from trauma, even though their eyes work fine? Of soldiers who come home from war unable to move their legs, even though the doctors can't find anything wrong? She turned back to Harrison. Your Honor, you have it too. I read about your accident. The doctors said you could have recovered more than you did, that your mind held you back. You chose the wheelchair because it was safer than risking another fall. Harrison's face went white. Young lady, you have no right. I have every right, Lily interrupted. Because we're the same. Both paralyzed by fear. Both hiding in these chairs because it's easier than facing what scares us. You've been on that bench for 15 years, judging everyone else, never wondering if maybe you're judging wrong. If maybe fear is making you see guilt where there's innocence. James was crying now, tears streaming down his face. Lily, baby, don't do this for me. But Lily wasn't listening to her father. She was looking at the judge. You want proof? You want to see if I'm telling the truth? Then watch. She put her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively. Harrison found himself unable to look away, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch this impossible child attempt an impossible thing. Lily, no, James said. You don't have to prove anything. Yes, I do, Lily said. Her arms trembled as she pushed against the armrests. I have to prove that fear can be broken, that choosing courage is possible, that we're not stuck in these chairs forever unless we decide to be. She pushed harder, her face contorted with effort. Not physical effort. The doctors had always said her muscles were fine. But the effort of fighting through 4 years of psychological barriers, 4 years of her mind telling her that legs didn't work, couldn't work, would never work again. I choose to walk, Lily said through gritted teeth. I choose to move forward. I choose to let go of that night. I choose. Her legs moved. Just a fraction. Just the smallest shift of muscle that hadn't moved in 4 years. The courtroom gasped. Harrison gripped his armrest so tight his knuckles went white. I choose to save my father, Lily continued. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I choose to be brave. I choose. She stood up. It wasn't graceful. Her legs shook violently, threatening to collapse under her weight. She gripped the wheelchair for support, her entire body trembling. But she was standing. After 4 years in a wheelchair, Lily Cooper was on her feet. The courtroom erupted. People jumped to their feet. Someone screamed. The bailiffs moved forward instinctively, then stopped. Unsure what protocol existed for a miracle in a courtroom, James broke free from the bailiff holding him and rushed forward, catching his daughter as her legs finally gave out. But she'd done it. She'd stood. She'd proven that the impossible was only impossible until someone decided it wasn't. Harrison sat frozen in his wheelchair, staring at the girl in her father's arms. She'd done what he hadn't been able to do in 15 years. She'd chosen courage over fear. She'd walked, and in that moment, watching a 9-year-old accomplish what he'd convinced himself was impossible, Judge Harrison Stone felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart. Something deeper. The wall he'd built around his fear. The certainty that had kept him in this chair long after his body had healed enough to try walking again. Recess, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This court is in recess. He rolled backward from the bench, away from the chaos in his courtroom, away from the impossible thing he'd just witnessed. He made it to his chambers before the shaking started, before the tears came, before everything he'd believed about justice and truth and his own limitations came crashing down around him, because a 9-year-old girl had just shown him that he'd been wrong about everything. In his chambers, Harrison Stone sat in his wheelchair and tried to remember how to breathe. His hands shook as he reached for the phone. He needed to call someone. His clerk. The prosecutor. Someone who could make sense of what had just happened in his courtroom. Instead, he called Dr. Raymond Chen, the neurologist who'd been treating him since the accident. Harrison? Dr. Chen's voice carried surprise. Harrison never called, never reached out, never asked for help. Is everything all right? I just watched a child stand up from a wheelchair, Harrison said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Psychogenic paralysis. She just decided to walk and she did. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Harrison, you know that's not how it works. The mental component is complex. It's not just willpower. But it happened, Harrison interrupted. I saw it. In my courtroom. She stood up. Another pause. Then gently, Harrison, when was the last time you tried to stand? The question hit like a physical blow. Harrison looked down at his legs, motionless beneath his robes. You know when. 6 months after the accident. I tried everything. It didn't work. You tried for 6 months, Dr. Chen corrected. And then you stopped. You decided the wheelchair was permanent, and you built your life around that decision. But Harrison, the scans we did last year showed significant healing, more than we expected. Your spine has repaired itself better than we initially thought possible. Then why can't I walk? Harrison's voice cracked. Because you won't let yourself, Dr. Chen said simply. Your mind decided that the risk of falling again, of being vulnerable again, was too great. So it keeps you in that chair where it's safe, where you're in control. Harrison closed his eyes. He'd heard this before, had dismissed it as psychobabble. But he'd just watched a 9-year-old prove that the mind's prison could be unlocked. If she could do it, what did that say about him? A knock on the chamber door interrupted his thoughts. His clerk, Janet, poked her head in. Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation. The police just brought in a man named Derek Walsh. He's asking to speak with you urgently. Something about the Cooper case. Harrison straightened. Derek Walsh? I don't know that name. He works for Meridian Industries, Janet said. He seems very agitated. Says he needs to confess something. 20 minutes later, Harrison sat across from Derek Walsh in a conference room. Walsh was 32, with the nervous energy of a man whose conscience had finally caught up with his crimes. A detective stood by the door recording everything. I framed James Cooper, Walsh said without preamble. The robbery, the evidence, all of it. I did it and I made sure he'd take the fall. Harrison's jaw tightened. Why are you confessing now? Walsh laughed bitterly. You really have to ask? It's all over the news. The girl in the wheelchair who stood up in your courtroom, her father is innocent and she proved it by doing the impossible. He wiped his eyes. I saw the footage, saw her stand, and I realized I couldn't live with it anymore. Couldn't let an innocent man go to prison while his daughter performs miracles just to save him. Walsh pulled out a folder. Inside were documents, security footage files, bank transfers, evidence of a scheme to steal and sell experimental medications from Meridian Industries. Evidence that he'd chosen James Cooper at random as his scapegoat. Evidence that he'd paid off a security guard to manipulate footage and plant items in Cooper's apartment. I thought I was smart, Walsh said. Thought I'd gotten away with it. But then I saw that little girl and I realized I'm just a coward. She had more courage in her 9 years than I've had in my entire life. The detective was already on his phone, calling for backup, starting the process that would lead to Walsh's arrest and Cooper's exoneration. But Harrison barely heard it. He was thinking about courage, about fear, about the choices people made when everything was on the line. An hour later, Harrison rolled back into courtroom 4B. The gallery was packed. News had spread fast. The girl who walked, the judge who might have convicted an innocent man, the confession that proved everything. James Cooper stood before the bench again, but this time his chains were gone. His public defender looked dazed, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Lily sat in her wheelchair in the front row, Mrs. Patterson beside her. her small hand gripping the armrests. She'd collapsed after standing, her legs unable to maintain what her will had forced them to do. The paramedics had wanted to take her to the hospital, but she'd refused. Said she needed to be here when her father was freed. Harrison looked at the papers before him. Derek Walsh's confession, the evidence that proved James Cooper's innocence. The journal they'd retrieved from Cooper's apartment. Every entry corroborated by phone records, receipts, timestamps that proved he'd been exactly where he said he was. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison began, and his voice carried a weight it hadn't held that morning. "In light of new evidence that has come to light, including a full confession from the actual perpetrator of the crime for which you were convicted, this court has no choice but to vacate your conviction immediately." James's knees buckled. His lawyer caught him. In the gallery, people were crying. Mrs. Patterson pulled Lily close, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "I want to apologize. To you, Mr. Cooper, and to your daughter. This court failed you. I failed you. I allowed the appearance of evidence to substitute for thorough investigation. I allowed my own certainty to blind me to reasonable doubt." He looked directly at Lily. "Your daughter showed more wisdom and courage today than I've shown in 23 years on this bench. She proved that the impossible is only impossible until someone decides it isn't." Harrison took a deep breath. What he was about to do was insane, reckless. Everything his careful, controlled life had been designed to avoid. But he'd just watched a 9-year-old risk everything for truth. He could do no less. "This court is adjourned," he said. And then, before he could talk himself out of it, before fear could reassert its grip, Harrison Stone put his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair and pushed. The courtroom went silent. Every eye focused on the judge, on the man who hadn't stood in 15 years, on the person who'd built an entire identity around the wheelchair and the certainty that walking was impossible. Harrison's arms trembled. His legs, motionless for so long, resisted. His mind screamed warnings. What if he fell? What if he failed in front of all these people? What if the wheelchair was all he'd ever be? Then he looked at Lily, at this child who'd conquered fear to save her father. If she could do it, he could at least try. He pushed harder, felt his weight shift forward, felt his legs take the burden they hadn't carried in a decade and a half. The sensation was overwhelming. Pain and possibility mixed together in equal measure. And then Harrison Stone stood up. It wasn't steady. His legs shook so badly he had to grip the bench for support. 15 years of atrophied muscles screamed in protest. But he was standing, actually standing, looking at his courtroom from a height he'd almost forgotten existed. The courtroom erupted in applause. People were on their feet, crying, cheering. James Cooper was openly weeping. Even the bailiffs, trained to maintain order, were clapping. But Harrison only saw Lily. She was smiling at him, this little girl in a wheelchair who'd taught a judge about justice, about courage, about the price of truth and the cost of certainty. His legs gave out. He collapsed back into the wheelchair, gasping for breath. But it didn't matter. He'd stood, just like Lily had stood. They'd both proven that paralysis, whether physical or mental, wasn't permanent unless you decided it was. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion, "you're free to go. Take your daughter home. And I'm sorry." For all of it, James didn't wait for formal dismissal. He rushed to Lily, pulled her into his arms, held her like he'd never let go. Father and daughter, both victims of a system that had failed them, both saved by Lily's impossible courage. As the courtroom slowly emptied, as the news crews set up outside to cover the story of the judge who stood and the girl who walked, Harrison sat in his chambers and called Dr. Chen again. "I stood," he said simply. "I know," Dr. Chen replied. "I'm watching the news. Harrison, this is huge. This means we can start real physical therapy, real recovery. You could walk again. Really walk." "I know," Harrison said. "And I will. But first I have something else to do." He hung up and rolled to his desk, opened his laptop, started typing his resignation from the bench. Not immediately, not until he could ensure a smooth transition. But soon, because a 9-year-old had shown him that he'd been wrong about more than just James Cooper. He'd been wrong about justice, about certainty, about the danger of a system where people in power stopped questioning their own assumptions. Harrison Stone had spent 15 years hiding in a wheelchair, Hiding behind a bench, hiding from the vulnerability of being human. No more, it was time to stand, in every sense of the word. Three months later, Harrison Stone walked into a rehabilitation center in downtown Chicago. Not rolled, walked, with a cane, with effort, with muscles that still remembered how to forget, but walked nonetheless. Dr. Chen met him in the lobby, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Harrison, look at you!" "Don't get too excited," Harrison said, leaning heavily on the cane. "I can walk about 100 feet before I need a break, and stairs are still my enemy. But it's progress." "It's a miracle," Dr. Chen corrected. 3 months ago you hadn't stood in 15 years, now you're walking. Do you know how rare that is? How much courage it takes?" Harrison shook his head. "I'm not the one with courage. I just followed where a 9-year-old led." He'd come to the rehab center for a specific reason, not for his own therapy, though he still came 3 times a week for that. He'd come because Lily Cooper was here too, working with her own therapist to strengthen the legs that had rediscovered movement. Harrison found her in the therapy gym, using parallel bars to practice walking. Her face was set in concentration, her small hands gripping the bars as she took careful steps. 1 foot, then the other, then back again. She'd made remarkable progress. The doctor said that once the psychological barrier broke, her body had remembered everything it had forgotten. She still used the wheelchair sometimes when she was tired or when her muscles protested too much, but she could walk now. Actually, walk. "Judge Stone!" Lily's face lit up when she saw him. She carefully turned, maintaining her grip on the bars. "You came!" "I told you I would," Harrison said. He walked slowly to a nearby bench and sat, his legs grateful for the rest. "How's it going?" "Good," Lily said. "My therapist says I'm doing great. Better than expected." She took 3 more steps, then back. "What about you?" "Slow," Harrison admitted. "But forward. Always forward." James Cooper appeared from the waiting area, carrying 2 bottles of water. When he saw Harrison, his expression shifted through several emotions: gratitude, wariness, acceptance. The 2 men had spoken several times since that day in court, awkward conversations about justice and mistakes and moving forward. James had been compensated for his wrongful conviction. Derek Walsh was serving 8 years for theft and fraud. The system had corrected its error, but some wounds took longer to heal than others. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison nodded. "Judge," James replied, then corrected himself. "Harrison, I keep forgetting you resigned." "Retired," Harrison said. "There's a difference. Resigned implies I was forced out. Retired means I chose to leave." And he had chosen. After 23 years on the bench, Harrison had stepped down. Not in disgrace, though some in the legal community had whispered about the Cooper case, but because he'd realized that sitting in judgment of others required a humility he'd lost somewhere along the way. He'd been replaced by Judge Maria Santos, a woman who'd spent 10 years as a public defender before joining the bench, someone who understood that justice wasn't about certainty, but about the constant, humble search for truth. "What will you do now?" James asked, sitting on the bench beside Harrison. "I can't imagine you're the retiring type." Harrison smiled. "Actually, I've been talking to the Innocence Project. They're always looking for people who understand the legal system, who can help review cases where there might have been wrongful convictions." James's eyebrows rose. "Seriously?" "Lily taught me something," Harrison said, watching the girl practice walking. "She taught me that mistakes can be corrected, that it's never too late to change direction. That courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about acting despite the fear." He looked at James. "I put you in prison because I was certain, because I'd stopped questioning my own judgment. I can't undo that mistake, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure it doesn't happen to someone else." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Thank you for standing up, for admitting you were wrong, for being brave enough to change." Harrison shook his hand. "Thank your daughter. She's the brave one." Lily finished her therapy session and walked, slowly but steadily, to where the 2 men sat. Her therapist had brought her wheelchair, but Lily waved it away. She wanted to walk. "Dad," she said, "can Harrison come to dinner tonight? I want to show him the scrapbook we made." James looked surprised, then thoughtful. If Harrison wants to, he's welcome. Harrison felt something warm spread through his chest. An invitation, a bridge being built between two families that had been brought together by tragedy and transformed by courage. "I'd be honored," he said. That evening, in the small apartment that James and Lily called home, Harrison sat at a kitchen table and looked through a scrapbook. It was filled with newspaper clippings about the case, about Lily standing in court, about Harrison rising from his wheelchair, about Derek Walsh's confession and James's exoneration. But it also had other things. Photos of Lily walking for the first time outside the courthouse, pictures of her first day back at school, standing with her friends, a drawing she'd made of her mother, with a note that said, "I walked for you, Mom. I finally moved forward." "We're calling it our Book of Courage," Lily explained, sitting beside Harrison, "because that's what it's really about. Not miracles or medicine, just people choosing to be brave." Harrison turned the pages slowly. Toward the back, he found something that made his breath catch. A photo of him, taken by a court photographer the moment he'd stood up. His face was twisted in effort and fear and determination. Below it, in Lily's careful handwriting, "Judge Stone chooses courage." "I was terrified," Harrison admitted. "When I pushed up from that chair, all I could think about was falling, about failing in front of everyone." "But you did it anyway," Lily said simply. "That's what courage is." James brought out dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and salad. They ate together. Three people who'd been strangers 3 months ago, now connected by the invisible threads of shared experience and mutual transformation. As Harrison prepared to leave, using his cane to walk to the door, Lily stopped him. "Harrison," she said, and he noticed she'd dropped the judge entirely. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy now? Like, happier than you were before?" Harrison considered the question. 3 months ago, he'd been certain of everything. His place in the world, his limitations, his understanding of justice. Now he was uncertain about almost everything. Learning to walk again, learning to question his assumptions, learning to be human instead of an infallible authority. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm happier, because I'm real now. Not perfect, not certain. Just real." Lily smiled. "Good, because that's all we ever needed you to be." Walking to his car, Harrison thought about the impossible chain of events that had brought him here. A wrongful conviction, a girl's desperate gamble, a moment of courage that had shattered everything he thought he knew. He'd spent 15 years in a wheelchair, convinced that walking was impossible. But it wasn't the wheelchair that had paralyzed him, it was fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of being wrong, fear of the messy, uncertain, beautiful chaos of being human. Lily Cooper, at 9 years old, had understood something Harrison had forgotten, that life wasn't about being certain or safe or in control. It was about taking risks, making mistakes, standing up even when falling was a possibility. Harrison got into his car and looked back at the apartment. Through the window, he could see Lily and James cleaning up from dinner, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of family. Two people who'd lost everything and found their way back to each other through courage. He started the engine and drove home, thinking about tomorrow's meeting with the Innocence Project, about the cases he'd review, about the people still sitting in prison because someone, somewhere, had been too certain about their guilt. Harrison Stone had learned the most important lesson of his life from a 9-year-old in a wheelchair. That justice wasn't about being right. It was about being willing to admit when you were wrong, about standing up even when it was terrifying, about walking forward even when the path was uncertain. And he would spend the rest of his life honoring that lesson, one uncertain step at a time. Because in the end, that's all courage really was. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it, to stand up, even if you might fall, to walk, even if your legs had forgotten how. Lily had walked to save her father. Harrison had walked because she'd shown him it was possible, and together they'd proven that miracles weren't about the supernatural. They were about the very human choice to be brave when everything inside you screamed to stay safe. The girl in the wheelchair stood. The judge in the wheelchair stood. And in standing, they'd both learned to walk again. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered.